Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into the holiday edition of my top starts and sits for week 16 of this NFL season. That means you guys have a chance to get to the championship game. And let's just hope I can give you guys some quality advice so you can set your lineups. But also, don't forget, hopefully you're still watching these videos because I always like to factor my starts and sits into daily fantasy football lineups. Any of these starts or sits, I put these together on FanDuel, DraftKings, even my underdog pick'ems. I consider these names when I do that. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into this video as always, starting at the quarterback position. My top start of the week, I'm going to go with that man that is coming off one of the best, actually the best performance by a road quarterback in Lambeau Field. Baker Mayfield against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Jaguars are giving up 20 points per game to quarterbacks this year. That is the third most allowed in the NFL. And then when we look at what the Tampa Bay defense has allowed quarterbacks to do against them over their last 4 games, 3 different quarterbacks have thrown over 300 passing yards against. I'm sorry, what the Jaguars defense has allowed. I said Tampa's. What the Jaguars defense has allowed in the last 4 games. Their defense have allowed 3 different quarterbacks to throw over 300 passing yards against them, and they've given up 7 passing touchdowns, so almost 2 touchdowns a game through the air, and with 3 interceptions. But as I always say, depending on what league you play in, interceptions really don't affect your total points by the end of the game. My other top start, I hinted at it last night in my waiver wire video. I like Derek Carr in this Thursday night matchup, going against the Rams defense, who are giving up 18.4 points per game this season. That is the 7th most allowed. And then as far as the Rams defense over their last 4 games, they've allowed 3 different quarterbacks to throw over 250 passing yards against them, and they have given up 9 passing touchdowns. So they are giving up more than just over 2 touchdowns through the air over their last 4 games. If you spread it out over their last 4 games, they've also picked off the quarterback 3 times. So yeah, if you are looking for a pair of streaming options at the position this week, I would definitely consider either Baker Mayfield or Derek Carr in week 16. My top sits, I am going to go with Jordan Love against the Panthers. And you guys have probably heard me say this before when I mentioned about not playing a quarterback against the Panthers. It's not because the Panthers have this all-star defense. Obviously, they did. They've had more than 2 wins. It's just that teams they find more success running the ball against them. And then outside of the Falcons, most teams end up getting up on them in the scoreboard, so they don't have to throw the ball a lot in the second half. So that's why they don't really give up much points per game as far as fantasy. So speaking of that, quarterbacks have only scored 12.8 points per game against the Panthers defense this year. That is tied now for the second fewest across the league. Then when you look at the last 4 games, as far as what quarterbacks have done against the Panthers defense, not one quarterback threw for over 205 passing yards, and they've only allowed 4 passing touchdowns with 3 interceptions. So it definitely feels like if you play Love, you got to hope that he gets you at least a pair of touchdowns to give you a solid performance, because he might not get the yards, especially if the Packers can get up big on the scoreboard on Sunday. Now, my other top sit, this is a Thursday night matchup, and I understand because Stafford has been playing really good ball lately, so I understand why you might trust him in your seasonal leagues. As far as your daily lineups, when you put together that Thursday night daily lineup, I would definitely consider not playing Stafford. I would probably play Derek Carr in my quarterback spot over him. And the reason why, when you look at the data points, the Saints have allowed 13.9 points per game in fantasy to quarterbacks this year. That is the 4th fewest in the NFL. And then in their last 4 games, not one quarterback has thrown over 215 yards against their defense, and they've only allowed 3 passing touchdowns with 2 interceptions in their last 4 games. So just like Love, it definitely feels like if you play Stafford, you gotta hope he at least throws a pair of touchdowns so he can give you a solid floor. If you have a better option than Stafford, I would definitely consider it this week. Moving into my top starts and sits at running backs, starting with obviously the top start as I always do. Breece Hall against the Commanders. The Commanders defense are giving up 19.3 points per game to running backs this season. That's tied for the 6th most allowed. And then you look at their last 4 games, I mean, their defense has completely fallen apart, right? They've allowed 3 different running backs to run for at least 75 rushing yards on their defense. And they've given up 8 running back touchdowns in their last 4 games. So that's 2 running back touchdowns a game game over the last 4 weeks. So that's why I definitely like Breece Hall to have a ceiling performance against Washington. My other top start, I'm going to go with Chuba Hubbard against the Packers defense. Packers defense has struggled to defend the run this season. As far as fantasy, they've given up 19.1 points per game. That is the 7th most allowed. And then you look at the last 4 games from the Packers defense, 3 different running backs have ran over 85 rushing yards against them, and they have given up 5 running back touchdowns. So given up a lot of yards, giving up at least 1 running back touchdown a game. So I like a nice little solid performance out of Hubbard against Green Bay this week. Now my top sits, I know I'm probably going to catch flack for that first name listed there, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery against the Vikings. So if you guys have been with me all season, Gibbs, it's time to get to the championship. He's got you here. You're going to play him, right? So I would just temper your expectations if you play Gibbs, because I get why you're going to play him, because he offers such a high ceiling. Now, David Montgomery, he's had those high ceiling performances. Kind of it's tapered off as Gibbs has been more of the, I want to say called focal point, because they are still splitting the touches, but he's just not getting those like 3 touchdowns a game like he has at points throughout this year. Now, the reason why is you just got to look at this matchup. The Minnesota Vikings have only given up 12.9 points per game to the running back position. That's tied for the second fewest. So, and this is a backfield that splits the carries. So that's, you're talking about a little over around 6.5 points. Both these backs have the split if the Minnesota Vikings can keep up to their average in this game. Now, over their last 4 games, no running back has finished over 50 rushing yards. So if a running back does get over 50 rushing yards, you got to hope it's either Gibbs or Montgomery, whatever one you're playing, if you do decide to do that. And they've only given up 1 running back touchdown in those 4 games as well. So again, you're going to probably play Gibbs. I can understand why you would probably play Montgomery. But if you do guys play them in your seasonal leagues, just temper your expectations. You got to hope they at least get you a touchdown in this game, because the Minnesota Vikings have been very stiff against the against running backs over their last 4 weeks. My other top sit, he plays in that Thursday night game. I'm going to go with Alvin Kamara against the Rams. Now, you're probably going to play Alvin Kamara. I get it. He was probably a round 2, round 3 draft pick for you. And you got to get to the championship game, so maybe you do play him, so I temper your expectations. But going against a very good Rams defense that's been really good against the running back position this season. They're only giving up 12.9 points per game. That is also tied for the second fewest, tied with Minnesota. And then over their last 4 games, not one running back has finished over 55 rushing yards against their defense. And they have also only allowed 1 running back touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. So if you do play Kamara, I mean, it definitely does feel like this is going to be I hope he just at least gets in the end zone to give me a good high floor game out of him. But again, temper your expectations on my top 2 sits that I listed off. But as far as daily lineups this weekend, when you put them together, those are going to be a few names that I'm actually going to be looking to avoid out of my lineups. Moving into my wide receiver position, my top start of the week, I am going to go with Garrett Wilson against the Commanders. Just like Breece Hall, he's got a great matchup this week to explode and have a ceiling performance. And I think that's regardless of whoever's throwing him the ball, just because of how bad that secondary has been playing for the Commanders over this last 2 months. And when we look at throughout the season, they're giving up 29.8 points per game to wide receivers. That's the second most allowed in the NFL. Over the last 4 games, they've allowed 3 different wide receivers to finish with at least 80 receiving yards, and they have given up 8 wide receiver touchdowns in those 4 games. So that's 2 wide receiver touchdowns a game, along with a bunch of yards. So I like Wilson to give you a ceiling performance in Week 16. My other top start, I am going to go with DeAndre Hopkins against the Seahawks. Seahawks are giving up 23.7 points per game this year. That is the 7th most allowed. When you look at the last 4 games, they've allowed 4 different wide receivers to finish over 75 receiving yards. Then you got DeAndre Hopkins, who's the alpha in that room, so you know he's going to get the target. So I do like the chances he's going to be the 5th wide receiver over the last 5 weeks to go over 75 receiving yards against their defense. And then they have allowed 6 wide receiver touchdowns in the last 4 games. So I definitely like DeAndre Hopkins as a solid play this week. My top sits. Now, that top one, you got to play Cooper Kupp, right? I get it. It's a championship game. Maybe you have to consider benching Puka Nacua, though, for real. Now, Cooper Kupp, temper expectations, like I've been saying throughout this video with some of these names, just because they have a tough matchup this week. Going against the Saints defense, who have only given up 17 points a game to the wide receiver position. So 8.5 points. If that stays true, and you got to keep in mind, there's other wide receivers in this LA offense that are going to get the ball, but that's 8.5 points if those two would split the 17 points a game that they're giving up. And then, but there maybe Kupp can at least be the one that does this, but only one wide receiver in the last 4 games for the Saints defense has finished over 75 receiving yards, and that was Drake London. So again, only one wide receiver did that. So probably going to be Kupp, not Nacua. Or it could be the opposite. It could be Nacua that does that, but not Kupp. So that's my whole point. There's balls that got to be spread around against a defense that's not been giving up a lot of points or yards. And speaking of points, they've only given up 2 wide receiver touchdowns in their last 4 games. So again, Cooper Kupp, temper expectations if you put them in your lineups this week. Puka Nacua, I could see the same thing. If you got to play him, temper expectations because they do draw a tough matchup. My other sit, I am going to go with Drake London against the Colts defense. The Colts have given up 19.8 points per game. That's the 11th fewest allowed, kind of outside the top 10. But they've been pretty solid against wide receivers over their last 4 games. Only one wide receiver finished with at least 75 receiving yards against the Colts in the last 4 weeks. That was DeAndre Hopkins, and he was right at the 75-yard mark. And then they have allowed, though, 4 wide receiver touchdowns. So I do feel like if you do play London, he's going to be a touchdown-dependent play. And I should factor in that Taylor Heinicke is playing in this game. You think, like, oh, Desmond Ridder has sucked. But in a small sample size, his targets have dropped when Heinicke is in the lineup compared to when Ridder is playing. So that's another thing to factor in if you're debating if you're going to play Drake London in Week 16. Moving into the final segment, my top tight end starts and sits. I hinted at this last night in my waiver wire video, but yes, Hunter Henry is my top start of the week at tight end. Going against the Broncos defense, who's given up 10.6 points per game. That is almost a point more than the second team that's given up the most points, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. And then when you look at the Broncos defense, over their last 4 games, they've allowed 3 different tight ends to finish with at least 50 receiving yards. They have allowed 4 tight end touchdowns, but I should go ahead and notate 3 of those touchdowns came in this past game, which could be a good showing to Sam Laporta in that Saturday night game in Week 15. But yeah, I definitely like Hunter Henry as a top streaming option at the position. Another guy I like this week, Pat Freiermuth against the Bengals. The Bengals are that second team that's allowing 9.7 points per game to the tight ends this season. Now, when we look actually at the history, though, of Pat Freiermuth, earlier this season, I think just a few weeks ago, he had 9 receptions for 120 yards against the Bengals. And then in the last 3 games that Pat Freiermuth has played Cincinnati, he's gotten at least 75 receiving yards. So he's got a strong history of playing them. And then when we look at what the Bengals have allowed over their last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different tight ends to finish over 60 receiving yards. And then they've allowed 2 tight end touchdowns over the last 4 games. So I definitely like Freiermuth just because of his strong performances that he's had against the Bengals over his last 3 games in his career. My other top sit, then moving into my top sits, my top sit of the week, I am going to go with Michael Mayer, the rookie tight end for Las Vegas. Against the Chiefs, Chiefs are only giving up 5.7 points per game this year. That is the 5th fewest. Now, when these 2 teams played earlier this season, Mayer finished with 2 receptions for 27 yards. And then when we look at the last 4 games, only 1 tight end finished over 40 receiving yards against the Kansas City Chiefs, which was Hunter Henry this past week. And then they've given up 2 tight end touchdowns. So if you were thinking about streaming Mayer, or you are streaming Mayer, I do feel like he's going to be a touchdown dependent play at the tight end position. My second top sit, I am going to go with Jake Ferguson against the Dolphins. Dolphins are only giving up 6.2 points per game to tight ends this year. That is the 9th fewest across the league. And then when we look at the last 4 games for Miami, it's not been fair to the tight end position. No tight ends have finished with at least 50 receiving yards against their defense in the last 4 weeks. And they have also not allowed a tight end to score a touchdown in their last 4 games. So I do feel like, just like Mayer, I do feel like this is going to be a touchdown dependent play just because tight ends haven't been finding success getting yards against the Dolphins defense, and they also have not found a way to cross the end zone. So yeah, that is my top starts and sits for week 16. As always though, if there's any players I did not speak about in this video, you can always get in the comments, the DMs, the text messages, however you get a hold of me, and I always try to get back to people as soon as I can. As always, hit the like, subscribe, and make sure you do follow me on all my social media platforms. Before I do hop off here, I do want to give an update for next week. Next week, I am going to be doing my final waiver wire video and my final waiver wire video, because if you're playing your championship game in week 18, there's something wrong with that and you need to talk to your commissioner and get that fixed. I will do a streamable defenses next week. I will do a streamable defenses in week 18 just because I'm going to continue to do my starts and sits through the end of the season. Because like I said, I like doing these because I think some people can take these and do your daily lineups with. And then one last note on next week, I'm off of work. I'm gonna be visiting my family for the holidays, so you're actually gonna get those videos pretty quickly. Tuesday, I plan on whenever after I wake up and get everything ready for it, I'm gonna record it and get it out sometime during the day. And same thing with my start sits on Wednesday. You're gonna get that at some point during the day, since I'll be off of my day job and I can get those out to you guys earlier. Other than that, I wish everybody a happy holidays. Have fun this week. This is my favorite time of the year, if you could not tell. So I'm gonna hop off here. I wish you guys all the luck. Hope you're back watching this video next week because you're in the championship game, not because you need some help with some daily lineups. Peace out and good luck, everybody.